Thank you. Now you can hear me. Granted, everybody in the world was playing Zelda that day, so I'll take what I can get. My name is Christy Lutz, and I write technical content for Wacom. And last year, I gave a speech at Write the Docs about finding courage in technical documentation. One of the main things that I talked about was how scary it can be to share your work and ask for feedback. And really, no matter what kind of documentarian you are, sharing your work and getting feedback is a part of all of our jobs, and even a part of all of our lives. And yet, for something so fundamental, it can be really painful. It can be overwhelming and terrifying. It can feel like you don't even want to do it, like you won't even survive it. Well, you will survive, because you're a documentarian. Feedback is your food. You take it in, and it makes you stronger. Feedback became so much easier for me after I learned design critique guidelines from a UX designer that I worked with at Monsoon Commerce. She taught me that design critique guidelines are a set of rules for giving and getting feedback that make feedback easier. Essentially, how to ask for feedback, how to give feedback, and how to deal with feedback. And this is so important because it puts the focus on the goals of the project and not on criticism. And when I say project, I mean that at every level. I've used design critique guidelines to get a single user help topic reviewed, and I've used them when redesigning a support center. So design critique guidelines are really scalable, and they can really help make your feedback workflow easier. But before we start talking about design critique guidelines, I want to talk about what's good about feedback. Feedback shows you how important you are, because without the work that you do, there is nothing for feedback to respond to. Your work forms the base, and it's off of this base that feedback can respond, that your project can move forward, and more importantly, that it's moving forward based on collaboration. What also makes it important about feedback is that it makes for better working relationships, specifically ones based on trust and vulnerability. I was recently at a Write the Docs meetup in Portland, and afterwards someone came up to me and asked me how I connect and communicate with my team every day. I'm embedded in the engineering department at Wacom. And I told her that I admit that I don't know things every day. And when I admit that I don't know things, what I'm saying is I need feedback and I need help. But I'm also telling my coworkers that they can tell me when they need feedback and when they need help. And when we're all talking about what we don't know and all talking about what we do, everyone gets smarter and your team gets stronger. And then in a story that's in the running for most meta ever, when I submitted the proposal for this presentation, I got some feedback on the title from the Write the Docs team. And Kelly O is our amazing speech wrangler, she and I shared some emails, and out of this feedback came a much better title. So feedback works because it makes things better every time. Okay, so what do you need to start using design critique guidelines? Who wants this one? Yeah. First, identify the stakeholders, including you, because you are an important stakeholder in all of your work. And one of my favorite things about design critique guidelines is if you do the work and you ask for the feedback and you incorporate the feedback, then you are the owner of it. And what that means is that you get to be the problem solver. So you get to figure out how the feedback fixes the problems of your project. Another thing you need to do for design critique guidelines is figure out the goals of your project with your stakeholders. And every project is a balance of considerations. Where I work at Wacom, we translate our user help into 14 different languages, and that takes time. So that's a consideration in every user help cycle. All projects are that way. Something that can really help you figure out this balance is to write what's normally called a problem statement, but I like to call a scope statement. And you start by talking about what kind of work you're sharing, and then you talk about the problems that this work is going to solve and why they're a problem. When you flesh this out, you can really get to the heart of the goals of your project, and it makes them easier to share. The last part of a scope statement is talking about what kind of feedback that you're looking for, and even more importantly, what kind of feedback you're not looking for. Because not all feedback is appropriate at all stages of a project. You might be willing to accept feedback about layout pages right now, but maybe you're beyond that. You know the goals of your project, so be specific about what kind of feedback you need and what you don't need at all times. And then write down some feedback guidelines. Feedback guidelines are an extension of your scope statement, but they're broader, and they're for every project. And you can include whatever you want in them. You can mine this speech for them, or you can completely make them up, as long as you illustrate how you like to receive feedback and what you need when you're asking for feedback. At Wacom, we write our user help with a casual tone, but we don't use contractions, because those don't translate very well. But my last job, we did use contractions. So every once in a while when I'm writing, they slip their way in there, and I usually find them. But that's something that I could ask for in my feedback guidelines. I could say, hey, let me know if you see contractions in my work. So be as specific as you want to be and ask for what you need in your feedback guidelines. Okay, so how do you start using design critique guidelines? Mic ding! Well, you just start. You did a bunch of work. You wrote down a scope statement. You figured out your goals. You identified your stakeholders. So now share that work and start to gather feedback. And when you're gathering feedback, it's important at this stage to just listen and take it all in. Something that can really help is if you repeat back what you've heard from your reviewers, but just adjust it slightly so that both parties know that you understand each other. And it's also important to remember at this stage that your reviewers are not judging you. They're not sitting there thinking, oh, why do I have to tell her that? They're actually thinking about how they can help you with their feedback. And they might even be thinking, is my feedback wrong? So don't worry about what your reviewers are thinking about you when you're getting feedback. You're doing your job well just by listening well. And it's also important to remember, you don't need to sell your work at this point. When you're gathering feedback is not the time that you need to convince people that you're good at your job, because you are, and your reviewers know that. So don't justify your intents, don't justify your decisions, just take it all in and write down as much as you can. Okay, how do you get people involved using design critique guidelines? Yeah. Design critique guidelines are very scalable. You can use them when you're sending an email, or you can throw a feedback party. When I worked at Jive Software in Monsoon Commerce, we threw thinking hat sessions when we were redesigning a support center and reorging some docs landing pages. And what we did is we got a conference room, we hung wireframes up on the wall, and then we invited everybody, which can feel really overwhelming because when you invite everybody, everybody's going to give you feedback. But what's great about inviting everybody is that when people give you feedback, they feel invested in your success. So get much feedback from as many people as you can. So we invited people to this room, to our conference room. When we got there, we gave everybody a role and a matching crown, which everyone looked great in. And we said, please limit your feedback to your role. So maybe you were a black hat and you could only give negative feedback. Or maybe you were a red hat and could only give emotional feedback. And when we asked our reviewers to limit their feedback to their role, they really embraced those roles and actually gave much better feedback. The feedback that we got from the Thinking Hat sessions radically improved those projects. So limiting the feedback that people can give and asking them to embrace a role will give you more focused feedback. When I worked at Viewpoint Construction Service, we were working a booth at our user conference, and we wanted to talk to the attendees about our user help. And, if you've ever worked a user booth at a user conference, if you say to someone, hey, do you want to have a conversation about our user help, you might get a polite decline. But if you say, hey, do you want to play with stickers, no one tells you no. So we had all of these great conversations with our attendees just by engaging with them, by giving them stickers and saying, hey, if you can answer yes to any of these questions, put a sticker up there. And we weren't trying to solve the mysteries of the documentarian universe. We just had 3 simple questions. But because of those 3 simple questions and because of the way we engaged, we found out which features our users were using, and if they didn't know about those features before, they knew about them now. And then scheduling a design review is a great way to really quickly get your thoughts in order. At Wacom, I'll sit down with a couple of stakeholders, and we'll go over a bunch of user help topics all at once. And after just a half an hour, it really helps me sort my thoughts out and saves me time later having to send follow-up emails. And you can use design critique guidelines anywhere and everywhere. If you have collaboration software at your work, like wikis, try and work publicly. And if you work publicly, expect that you might get some public feedback. one of my favorite feedback givers of all time, a woman I work with at Jive Software named Jenny Marks, she really used our work wikis to my benefit because she was always ready with constructive feedback, which made my work easier and saved me a lot of time. Another way you can work publicly, even if you don't have a work wiki, is to just hang up something by your desk or in a hallway, something that you need a quick feedback on, and let people use the couple of minutes in between meetings or when they need a break to give you some really quick feedback. And then remember your team, they're an important resource for feedback. I feel really lucky at Wacom because we have a dedicated part-time Docs Tools resource. He's in the audience today. His name is Arthur Krebsbach, and he is basically a unicorn of the documentarian universe. Because when we had an opening on our engineering team for someone to devote part of their time to Docs Tools, he volunteered for it. So he is my natural go-to for feedback. But even if you don't have someone like Arthur, just use your team whenever, maybe at a meeting, like in the first 5 awkward minutes before you're waiting for people to arrive. Just throw it a question. I was recently giving my daily report at a stand-up, and at the end of it, I threw out a question that I needed some feedback on. I wanted to know which term people preferred as the plural of stylus, styli or styluses. And after just a couple of minutes of lively conversation, one of my coworkers came up with an even better third option, stylus products. And because I took up that time at a meeting, I got an answer to a question that I needed. So don't be afraid to take up time at meetings, because you deserve that time, because you're an important part of the team. Okay, so how do you give feedback? Oh, you're gonna challenge me. Are you ready? Oh God, duck! Oh God, I did it! Okay, this is a wonderful summary by a woman named Judy Reeves, who wrote a book about design critique guidelines. And if you can embody this when you're giving a critique, then you are feedback royalty and you do not need to be here. But basically what this is saying is you're a person, so be a person. Human beings give really great feedback just because you're human, because you know what it's like to be a user. So yeah, maybe you're a SME for a project, but maybe you're also just a really good listener, or maybe you've never given feedback before. Remember your role, because it's very important when you're giving a review, but remember that you're a person beyond that too, and embrace your humanity. And connected to that, remember, everyone has to get feedback at some time, so give the kind of feedback that you would want to get. And if it helps, imagine that you're giving feedback to your nephew, or your daughter, or your cat, and give the kind of feedback you would want them to receive. This is the design critique guideline that everybody knows, and yet everybody forgets. All feedback should start with what's positive. I read this great article on the internet by these really smart ladies that suggested ending with it too, thereby making what they call the love sandwich. Because there's something good about everything you do, and there's something good about everything you review. So start your reviews with it every time. And then remember to ask questions when you're giving a review. Even if you think you understand what you're reviewing, ask questions. And even more powerfully, pose your critique in the form of a question. It can really help to make your critique sound more like a discussion and less like criticism. And another thing that can help to keep critiques from sounding personal is to take the emphasis off the word you. So instead of saying, you should have put better colors on this page, you could say, do you think this page would benefit from different colors? So ask as many questions as you can. And then, even if you're not in a thinking hat session, when you're reviewing, you always have one role. It is the most important role, and it is as the defender of the goals of the project. So for every single piece of feedback that you're going to give, always make sure it ties to the goals of the project. And something that can really help with this is if you defend your feedback to yourself before you hand it over. So for every single piece of feedback, ask yourself, why am I giving this feedback, and how does it support the goals of the project? Okay, how do you deal with feedback? Who's this one for? Who wants it? Ready? Ready? I want to start this section off by talking about a coworker of mine who dealt with feedback in such an amazing way recently. At Wacom, we do a small QA before we release our releases to our QA department, and it's called checklisting. And recently, I was the checklister for my coworker, Michael. And this being my first time checklisting, I was, shall we say, thorough. And in the light of that overwhelming amount of feedback, do you know what he said? He told me he wanted me to be his checklister next time too, because he is the king of feedback. And we can really learn something from Michael, because when you're given feedback, even a huge amount of it, remember, it puts you in the position of problem solver, which is a great position to be in, and a position that you can trust yourself to be in. I talked about my sister last year, and I'm going to talk about her again this year too. She was recently at her user help conference, and she was rewriting her entire user help set. And she was worried about the negative feedback that she would receive on the topics that she decided to write about first. So I suggested she take a tablet of paper and she write down the topics that people asked for. And that way they would feel validated and heard, really no matter what she did with that paper. And by having to write it down, my sister had to consider it. So if she heard it over and over again, she was going to move that topic to the top of her list. And what we can learn from this is that getting feedback is not about avoiding feedback, and it's not about being praised. It's about helping people. And there's a couple of tips and tricks that you can use in order to steel yourself when you know you're getting feedback. And the first one is understand the situation of your reviewer. If you're getting an overwhelming amount of feedback, celebrate it, because it means you're an important part of an important project. Another thing you can do when you're getting feedback is to immediately close it and say, I don't understand this yet, and then take a break. Grab some water, grab a drink. I know I'm always so much smarter after a walk. Distance can really give you clarity, and you really will understand the feedback better later and feel better about it. And then even though this is the design critique guideline that everybody forgets, even if your reviews don't start with what's positive, there is something good about everything you do. So if you're not hearing it, celebrate it in yourself, because you are good at this. And then this is my favorite part of design critique guidelines. You own all of the feedback because you have control and power in this process. You are not a documentation vending machine. Someone doesn't put a quarter in and out pops writing. You're a vital part of the process. So you and your stakeholders own that feedback and can do whatever you want with it. You can ignore it. You can push it aside. You can, like I said last year, pour rum all over it and light it on fire. You can do whatever you want with it. And when I say you can do whatever you want with it, I don't mean ignore it. I just want you to believe that you have power in this process, because you could light it on fire, couldn't you? It's just that you won't, because you're smarter and stronger than that. Okay, so how do you measure your results? Ready? Woo. First, follow up on anything that you don't understand. And then, once you've gathered everything and you've followed up on everything, you and your stakeholders sit down with each piece of feedback and you ask yourself, does it support the goals of the project? And you'll have to expect that for some pieces of feedback, the answer will be no. I think it's the initial instinct of a lot of documentarians to say, oh, I was right and they were wrong. Or excuse me, they're right and I was wrong. To take feedback as definitive truth, because SME has the word expert in it. But not all feedback is appropriate for your project at all times. So trust yourself. You know the goals of the project better than anyone else. And then have a discussion in your head about the feedback, because feedback is technically a discussion. Feedback is not an opportunity for your coworkers to tell you you're wrong. It's actually a back and forth. So have a discussion in your head about why you're accepting or rejecting each piece of feedback. Okay. And then finally, how do you report your results? Ooh, I don't know if I can make it to you. Ooh. First, appreciate your reviewers, because they're important to the process. So thank them and let them know what your next steps are going to be. And then remember, when you're reporting your results, it's not about winning. It's not about, I took your stuff and I didn't take yours and you were right and you were wrong. Frame your reporting of your results with respect to the goals. And then remember, when you're working on a project, you have specific insight into how that project works. So if it's taking a long time to work on, it could be that that project itself could use some feedback. That's the circle of life for feedback. You are in a place of expertise where you too can give feedback in this process. And then remember, it's not your goal to make everyone happy when you're reporting on your results. You do not have to report on every single piece of feedback. You don't have to say, oh, we accepted this and here's why. Oh, we rejected this and here's why. Definitely have your reasons and be ready to discuss, but you don't have to report or engage on every single one of them. Because the goal of the project is never to fix everything now. The goal is much smaller than that, and it's your job to stick to the goal. Also, projects are iterative, which means this is not the end. On the one hand, that's really overwhelming because it means, yeah, you will look for docs tools again. You will write this user help topic again. But on the other hand, it's really liberating because even if you reject a piece of feedback, it's not dead. It still has a chance to make your projects better in the future. And then, because I know a lot of you will really take this to heart and try to figure out how design critique guidelines will make your feedback workflow better, I want you to believe that you have real power in this and that you can teach design critique guidelines to your team. Because if you teach design critique guidelines to your team, then feedback gets better for your whole team and ultimately for you. Because it gets less painful the more people who know design critique guidelines. And even though feedback can be overwhelming and terrifying, and you feel like you won't even survive, you are brave just by asking for feedback. Because just by asking for feedback, you have already succeeded. Thank you.